Hello, friends of Ebikeitalia and beyond. I'm Phil, and welcome to the ultimate guide to rear suspensions. Music. All right, guys, it's 2024, and we're still talking about rear suspensions, and it's actually a very broad and much debated topic. Today, I'll try to be as precise as possible about many concepts because often when choosing a bicycle, it's partly for the design, partly for the lines, and sometimes not for the content, but rear suspensions are very important. It's especially important for bikes that cost thousands and thousands of euros, so I encourage you to educate yourselves a bit about these things. I invite you to give a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel right away, because the topic is interesting, vast, and important. Skip forward and backward, the fun part of these videos. You can go back and revisit the concepts when you need to find the information you want. What are they for? Because often in our group, you bought an enduro bike to ride on the cycle path, but why not? Because first of all, it's more comfortable, and you will have experienced this in every way. I often use my rigid carbon road bike, or a folding bike anyway, so I realize that every time I miss the suspensions, I'm uncomfortable. And so that's the first thing, the most obvious. The second thing is performance. It's without question anymore. Once, in the 1990s and 2000s, when rear suspensions started to arrive. First the front ones, then the rear ones. The arguments began, but are they really needed or not? By now we can say they are. They always are. First of all, because they improve contact with the ground, so every time we hit a small bump, the suspensions help us to limit it, the wheel lifting off the ground, thus increasing grip. And this happens both during acceleration, so in our case while climbing, and during braking, obviously also affecting handling, so the everyday riding. So, the question is, do we need suspensions? Especially the rear ones? Yes. Essentially, there are two things that affect our suspension. One is us. So the pedaling, the braking, every movement that we can do on the bike. And the other force came from the ground, the impacts that compressing our rear suspension. So, you will hear some more or less difficult terms to digest. I'll try to make them as easy as possible, than for the more technical ones. If you like, we can compare and review some data with the Engage suspension design, which is a very nice program, very simple to use. The demo is free, so you can download it, play with it a bit, and spend a few hours drawing your bike and understanding if there is a defect, its value, etc. My model for today is a DM679 designed by my friend Vannes Natalini from Bike World Extreme, which we can define as monocross or monoshock or monopivot, because this is the pivot point of our rear suspension, which is the simplest of all. And that doesn't mean it can't also be the best. Because today, we're going to discover that there might not be a perfect suspension, but there could be the best one for a specific use. But, at least from my experience, a suspension that's perfect in every way maybe doesn't exist. Let's get to the heart of the matter. The first force we will discuss about is the ground, that is, when the wheel hits an obstacle. First of all, let's talk about the axle path. What is it? Let's get back to talking about our single shock system, which is the simplest thing. As you can easily see or imagine, the suspension will move on a portion of an arc where the center of rotation of the arc will be our fulcrum. Very simple, right? So, depending on where the pivot point is positioned, we'll have a suspension that it's easier to get over front obstacle or to absorb vertical impacts. Let me give you a practical example. Let's imagine that we are hitting a curb, a rock, a root, anything. It's quite obvious that if the pivot is high enough, the suspension will be able to let the wheel get over the obstacle. Whereas if the pivot is lower, the suspension will struggle more to absorb this impact. And so the wheel will literally get stuck. In fact, if you notice, we sacrifice many rear wheels against this hit. Differently, if we are jumpers, for example, when we land from an obstacle, a step from what is a jump, a suspension with a lower fulcrum, it will be absolutely facilitated to absorb this impact. Here we are in our software, our virtual studio garage. This is a simple monocross or monoshock rear suspension. The first analysis we can do is on the axle path, which is the trajectory of our wheel. You can see in this case that the main pivot of the suspension is very low, and it makes the part of the arch where it moves on tend to shorten the rear center. So this suspension, we understand, will work well on a certain type of impact, more on a vertical impact. If we raise the pivot point, clearly the lever arm changes between the shock absorber and our rear hub. This also increases the travel, but what we are interested in, however, is to see rather the elongation. One notable thing we managed to achieve, which we can measure, is 2 centimeters. Therefore, we know that this type of suspension will perform better when overcoming obstacles. The second important force is the one we exert on the pedals. Whether or not it is motorized, our bicycle will always respond to this. That is, the chain pulls the cassette. And this pulls with more or less force depending on the type of suspension towards the frame. We will analyze them. What happens? Some forces and some things happening on the bicycle can be interpreted in two ways: from the suspension, from the rear wheel, or from the crankset, from the chain pull. Look, this is something we need to talk about, because the phenomenon I just talked about, that is, our force applied on the pedal, is read as anti-squat. What do I mean? The anti-squat feature is the anti-sinking feature. Imagine that we are pushing hard on the cranks, the suspension is pulled towards the frame, and this implies that the suspension opens literally the shock, and we are not unbalanced backwards. I recently noticed, even while riding a scooter downtown, if you notice, some scooters when they accelerate don't pitch backwards but they push forwards. And this is due to the chain pull on the rear frame. It's the same for us, though we don't have all these horsepower, we can't rely on this, but it's very important, especially useful uphill, because the suspension doesn't compress too much, so we don't risk tipping over backward. Now, to graphically display the anti-squat force, the process might seem a bit complex at first. I know that, but slowly. I also hope to help you with this. First of all, we need to establish our center of gravity, identifiable, let's say, with the navel or the hips, where our weight is concentrated. Then I'll also explain why, because clearly this is a value that can vary, and so graphically and especially numerically could change the anti-squat percentage. The second thing to do is to draw a vertical line from the contact point of the front wheel that then passes. For the front hub, it's upwards, and then a line that goes through our center of gravity. In this horizontal turn, it intersects with the first line. We see it in this way. The point where the two lines intersect represents 100% of the anti-squat percentage. That is to say, the point where our rear suspension shouldn't swing uncontrolled. Let's say the point where our pedal efficiency could be maximized. As I was saying, if we change our center of gravity, we will also vary the threshold of our 100%. So this is another value to take with a grain of salt. But it is still interesting to make certain reasoning. At this point, the last big variable is the instant center of rotation, a slightly more complex little thing, which in the case of a monocross suspension corresponds to our main pivot. Let's imagine a horizontal line parallel to the ground, which we'll call the chain line. In this case, it coincides with where the chain ring passes. Then if we observe the movements of our rear frame, we can see all these lines. And the point that intersects the chain each time with the horizontal line I mentioned earlier. At that point, we draw a line starting from the contact point with the ground, and it goes upwards to meet our vertical anti-squat line that we created earlier. Here, we have an obviously exaggerated value of 185%. If we try to bring it to a more human value, then by putting a larger cog at the back, we see it going down to 153%. So this bike will probably still be not very efficient in pedaling from either side. Analyzing the same phenomenon in other way, that is from the wheel. We need to talk about pedal feedback or pedal kickback, which is when we hit an obstacle. The chain is pulled back, the crank moves towards us, and this causes a small, big problem because up here we have our 80 kilograms of rider. So quite often, if we are on step terrains or under stress, our weight greatly inhibits the work of the rear suspension. This, for better or worse, is about all types of rear suspensions. And therefore you understand that it's counterproductive. And it clearly varies depending on where we place the chain on the cassette. Look, for example, here we have the smallest cog. You see how much the crank moves the pedal arms. And now with the larger rear cog, look how much our pedal moves. What does this mean? That when we are climbing using the larger cogs, we could rely on that anti-squatting system I mentioned. In fact, we would have an advantage if we don't have a lockable shock absorber and so on. But be careful when going downhill this way, because the rear suspension will be very inhibited, very braked. You will feel it very stiff, so when going downhill, always use a small cog. There's a great accessory that's trending now. I'm not paid to say this, I just like to. It's an Italian idea called O-chain. If mounted on the crankset, it helps to avoid a lot of this problem by allowing some movement in the crank arm. This is a great idea. The fact is, if we could go downhill without the chain, you would notice the difference in the rear suspension. The famous episode of that world champion who made a great descent without a chain and went very fast. Now, I don't follow races that much, but you know who I'm talking about. In this guide, I exclusively talk to you about the behavior of the rear suspensions in a neutral manner, because it's clear that shock absorbers can make a big difference. But for instance, with pedal kickback, you can have the best shock absorber in the world, but the problem remains, okay? Another important thing to consider is everything happening upstream a rear shock because, for example, here we have seen the first major category of rear suspensions, which we said are monocross, monoshock, monopivot, call them what you want anyway, a single pivot point. Everything that happens upstream, exactly, is a system to compress the shock absorber. Now here the shock absorber is compressed directly. This could imply a more or less linear, progressive or regressive behavior of the suspension. I will talk more about it in a bit, but this doesn't concern rear suspension designs. So let me give you two quick examples. The pull shock from Ancelotti is a system that guides the shock absorber, but remained monocross suspension, like the Scott Gambler, for example, or always monocross with a system that compresses the shock absorber with a claw, or even the evil ones, still the same thing, a monocross with a very fine shock absorber compression system to achieve a certain type of progression. Another example, Fantic uses a monocross system, even though it looks complicated. But we always have to look at the main pivot point of rotation, which is here, covered by the chain tensioner and the rear wheel. If they are directly connected, this is our actual rear triangle. This whole system, on the other hand, is used to compress the rear shock. we talked about the compression ratio. What is it? It's the ratio between the millimeters of shock absorber travel and the actual millimeters of wheel travel, which are clearly multiplied. Now, typically, an average is taken. It's usually around a ratio of 3 to 1. That means 1 millimeter of the shock absorber travel corresponds to 3 millimeters of travel at the wheel. So I often read I have a shock absorber with a 160 millimeter travel. No, you are referring to the millimeters of travel of the rear wheel, and you should actually check the millimeters of travel of your shock absorber. As I was saying, we take average ratio because this ratio can vary, resulting in a progressive, regressive, or linear ratio. This graph shows the leverage ratio, which is the compression ratio between the shock travel and wheel travel, roughly stay around 2.6. So this kind of graph shows us the travel of our rear suspension. It aligns with a very vague regressive final stage. This means that if we do some jumps, for example, we'll reach the bottom out very easily. Now, our model is perfect in this case because it shows us that simply changing the high pivot of the shock absorber without changing other parameters. Look at how much our leverage ratio changes. Here we have moved to a curve that is slightly progressive, which means for every millimeter of stroke in our shock absorber will correspond to fewer and fewer millimeters of wheel travel, making it progressively stiffer. If we play around even more and tweak our parameters, we can greatly increase our progression, turning our dummy bike into one suitable for jumps. But you see, for example, the compression ratio has increased a lot, meaning that this shock absorber starts from 4.15, our ratio reaches 3.6, the wheel travel has become immense because we are at 248 millimeters, so beyond downhill values, but this shock absorber will be very stressed, and this is a characteristic you must consider, especially if you are a particularly heavy biker, because a bike with a very high leverage ratio stresses the shock absorber a lot. So if you are a bit on the heavier side as a biker, I recommend a coil shock absorber. It gets stressed less. We can talk about this in detail later. To another place, and above all, to have a fairly low leverage ratio so as not to stress the shock absorber too much, the oil, etc., and get you to the bottom of the descent without the shock absorber losing its performance. For example, this gas is also a monocross, even if it might not seem like. This is our main pivot and the rear wheel. This is nice because it's all white, so this is our real rear frame. Everything else is used to compress the shock absorber. The third force that acts on the rear suspension is the brake. Every suspension instead reacts differently. Here we see what happens on a monocross suspension. All monocross suspensions. We spin our rear wheel, we brake, and as you could see, the suspension tends to compress. That is to compress the shock absorber. This phenomenon is called brake lockout, and it means that when we grip the rear brake, the suspension tends to compress. This clearly results in a stiffening of the rear suspension, so during braking, we will have a less active suspension. On the other hand, there are those who interpret this system in this way. You also see it in MotoGP sometimes. When we brake hard, the bike tends to pitch forward, creating strong front-end dive and compressing the front suspension a lot. With this system, the bike unloads the rear and we can stay a bit further back. To evaluate the actual behavior of a suspension during braking, we can also find a fairly simple graphical representation here that more or less mirrors that of anti-squat. So we draw out our lines, the one passing through the front wheel perpendicular to the ground and the one from our center of gravity parallel to the ground. Now, in the case of a monocross system, it is quite simple because we need to pass the line passing through the contact point to the rear wheel with our main pivot point. That is the only one there is. Maybe later we'll see instead what happens with slightly more complicated suspensions because we'll have to look for our instant center. Okay, this line goes to hit our end point, and it is noted that the anti-rise is at 108%. It means that the closer we get to 100%, the more the suspension will be compromised by the braking. And the ideal would be that our line is as low as possible, therefore, with a value close to the hub. This will never be possible. First of all, because if we play with our model, we can lower very much our pivot point. And at that point, no one would ever design a bike like that. Even if many years ago something like this may have existed and probably would have behaved quite neutrally, but I still have some doubts. And so, on an absolutely personal level, exposing this reasoning, even if we completely lowered this system, that is our rotational fulcrum, bringing to an extreme thing that would make no sense at all. And we could be totally sure of having completely neutral braking. This system would always move like a door. I can say, our force is applied here, and when we brake, with the experiment I just showed you, on the bench we spin the rear wheel. This force will definitely go, at least from my point of view, to compress the shock absorber, so this graphical representation has a reliable foundation, let's say. The only real experiments I can propose to evaluate the behavior of a braking suspension are, for now, to hit the trails and try it out on steps, try it on various bumps, both fast and slow ones, and trying to bounce on the bike at a certain speed on flat ground, keeping the brakes on to evaluate if the suspension gets too stiff or is free enough. So these are the only elements. I'll skip the floating brake system for now, which is a really cool topic. You can find some information about it in my Chimera project videos. But for now, let's move on. The second main scheme of the rear suspension is called 4-bar horsed Hlink. What happens? What happens is that, going back to the earlier discussion where I talked about the pivot center, here we're talking about the instant center, meaning the virtual pivot center, because this type of suspension doesn't have the rear wheel directly connected to the frame. In the middle, there's this joint that releases the entire trajectory of our arc. When I was talking at the beginning about axle path, that is the trajectory of the wheel, the Horst Hlink was a specialized patent from Mr. Horst that for 20 years was exclusively tied to Specialized and then gradually spread in Europe because obviously there were fees to use this patent. And then little by little all around the world, of course, there have been some copycats here and there. And now that it is free, everyone uses it because it also has a big advantage in braking, which, if studied in a certain way, can eliminate or greatly reduce the brake lockout we saw earlier. Or it can even be made completely opposite, in the sense that if the designer, as a philosophy of thought, sees that the suspension should compress a bit during braking, depending on the measurements and distances used in this geometry, it can perform like a single pivot suspension. Designing a 4-bar suspension with a Horst Hlink is truly an art of finding the right compromise between performance in climbing, descending, braking, compression, etc., because everything is possible. You're working within a margin of just a few centimeters because depending on where you position the Horst Hlink or the rear triangle, you'll experience a variety of behaviors. That's why some bikes may have great chain tension but might be a bit sluggish when braking, and vice versa. Keep in mind that the instant center always keeps moving in the space, so we can analyze it through the program I showed you and discover the actual trajectory of our wheel to understand if it's a trajectory that benefits obstacle clearance or jumps and a bit more racing-oriented driving. Focus, for example, is one of those brands that has abandoned the single pivot system to switch to a Hlink 4-bar linkage. Why? Now, here we are analyzing a suspension with a 4-bar style Hlink. Here it is, our magic Hlink. So first of all, we need to look at the fact that the rear wheel isn't directly connected to the frame. So in this diagram, you see the green bar and the rest in another color. And we need to understand that for every millimeter that the wheel moves, our center of rotation, the instant center, will change accordingly. And it is a virtual center of rotation, which we see represented by this point here, which, as you can see, moves depending on how much we compress our rear suspension. To find it, you need to draw two lines, one upwards and the other outwards, for these 2 points, and one for these 2 points, so that we intersect these points each time. And in this way, we can trace our instant center each time. What do we need it for? We need it to evaluate our results each time, anti-rise when it comes to braking. Now, this bike appears to be really well designed according to the evaluation parameters we have available with this software, and you can see the anti-rise is quite low, so braking will be relatively smooth. And then we can also evaluate its possible anti-squat behavior. You see, for example, we've selected the 34-tooth front chainring and the 50-tooth rear cog, and our anti-squat is at 104%, so very close to a maximum threshold. It's perfect. Now, if we put the smallest cog, it's clear that the anti-squat cancels out, so it goes very, very high. But if we set it in motion, our bike, and let's look at how much the crank arm moves. It moves very, very little, which works in our favor when it comes to downhill performance. If we set it to 50%, you can see it still moves within a tolerable range, which then translates to positive anti-squat, as we saw before. The third major category of the rear suspension, if we can call it that, is what's known as the virtual pivot point. Be careful, because virtual points pivot are also known as Hlink 4 bars, because as we've seen, the pivot is virtual, it's not fixed to an exact point. And here we have the sum of this system. If you look, the rear frame of this beautiful Santa Cruz is a single piece. However, unlike the first system we saw, which had a single pivot point, this one has two, 1 and 2. And so, the movement of the frame is absolutely floating. And depending on who studied the suspension and how it was designed, the movement, the axle path, or the rotation of the frame could be more or less vertical, tending to shorten or lengthen the frame and compress the damper in a certain way. In short, it's a vast world. To identify the virtual center of rotation, we need to align the two lines that pass through the two rotation fulcrums and the connecting rod. It's a bit complicated. I'll show it better with the program to clarify it well. Everyone suffers from brake lockout while braking, and chain tension depends a lot on who designed it and how they designed it. An enduro bike will be designed one way, a cross-country bike in another. Consider, for example, the latest Yeti 6-bar system, which is so complex, full of linkages, stuff like that, which remains a virtual pivot point. They have tried to optimize pedaling uphill and also the bike's behavior while braking. Did they succeed? The theory says one thing. In practice, it clearly has to be verified directly in the field. So, to find our instant center, we need to draw the usual two lines, one from here and one from here. So you see, it's like a mid-pivot. High pivots are all the rage now. I'm really happy about this. I'll skip over the chimera project here, but you can see the instant center moves and gradually lowers more and more, bringing along with it the anti-squat, anti-rise, etc. Basically, every bike should be analyzed in light of this. So, you see the movement is still quite efficient, both from the point of view of absorption, in the case of vertical loads, and for overcoming obstacles. Virtual pivot points of this type, as I said, can be very, very different from each other, so you can't generalize. But generally, they are excellent rear suspensions. Leaving aside the earlier point I made about evaluating each bike individually. All right, guys, that's all for today. I realize the topic is vast, with lots of names, technical stuff, and some boring things. But keep it in mind when you're choosing a bike, especially if you're going to spend 6, 7, 10,000 euros. Don't let yourself get tricked, so to speak, by just the color or shape. Also, consider the details, because 90% of a bike's quality comes from, sure, the material, but also the rear and front suspension. So keep that in mind, okay? Thank you for being here and sticking it out till the end. If you want to give us the thumbs up, let's do it, because it's the only way you can give us a bit of satisfaction. Thanks a lot. I invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, to join ebikeitalia on Facebook, where we can keep talking about rear suspensions, which you know is one of my favorite topics, and see you next time. Bye.